The golden sunset painted the lake in shades of amber and gold as I stood on the weathered dock, breathing in the scent of pine and fresh water. Birds called across the water, their songs mingling with the gentle lapping of waves against the shore. After 15 years of saving every spare dollar, working overtime and dreaming of this very moment, I had finally done it. I had purchased my own slice of lakefront paradise. The cabin itself was modest, 2 bedrooms, rustic kitchen, and a wide porch facing the water. But what made it perfect was the view, and most importantly, the deed that guaranteed access to this pristine lake. I closed my eyes and listened to the water gently kissing the shoreline. This was everything I had ever wanted. "You must be the new owner," a voice called from the neighboring property. A woman in her 60s waved from her garden. Her name was Martha, and she approached carrying a basket of fresh vegetables. "Welcome to Lake Evergreen. We do not get many newcomers here." She handed me the basket with a warm smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. I accepted her gift gratefully. "Thank you so much. I cannot believe this place is finally mine." I gestured toward the water. "I have been dreaming about living on a lake since I was a kid." Martha nodded, but something flashed across her face, concern perhaps. "Have you met any of the other neighbors yet, or received information about the community association?" There was a slight edge to her question. "Not yet," I replied. "The previous owner mentioned something about an HOA during closing, but I was honestly too excited about the lake access to worry about community rules." I laughed, but Martha did not join in. "Well," she said carefully, "just be sure to read everything they send you. Lake access can be complicated around here." Before I could ask what she meant, she glanced at her watch. "I should get back. Good luck settling in." As Martha walked away, I noticed a tall man watching us from the dock next door, arms crossed, expression unreadable. When our eyes met, he turned and disappeared into his house without acknowledging me. Not everyone would be as welcoming as Martha, it seemed. The following days were filled with unpacking and settling in. I spent evenings on the dock, planning where I would place my small fishing boat once I brought it from storage. One morning, a thick envelope appeared in my mailbox with "Lake Evergreen Community Association" printed across the top in navy blue letters. Inside was a welcome letter, community newsletter, and a spiral-bound book that must have been 90 pages thick. The cover read, "Community Bylaws and Regulations." I flipped through it casually, noticing sections about lawn maintenance, exterior paint colors, holiday decorations, and various other aspects of suburban life that now seemed to require permission. That night, the previous owner called to check how I was settling in. When I mentioned receiving the HOA packet, his tone changed. "I tried to warn you at closing," he said. "That woman runs the place like her personal kingdom." "What woman?" I asked. "Corinne Beaumont," he replied. "President of the HOA for 8 years running. Watch yourself with her and read the fine print about the lake. That was always the issue for me." I thanked him for the warning, but as I hung up and looked out at the moonlight dancing across the gentle waves, I could not imagine any problems that would outweigh the beauty before me. Standing on my dock, listening to the rhythmic sound of water against wood, I felt nothing but peace and possibility. Little did I know that beneath the tranquil surface of this community lurked currents of control and entitlement that would soon threaten to drown my dreams. The community center was a single-story brick building, with a parking lot already filled with luxury SUVs and high-end sedans when I arrived for my first HOA meeting. Inside, about 30 residents sat in rows of metal folding chairs, speaking in hushed tones that immediately fell silent when the door at the side of the room opened. The woman who entered moved with purposeful strides, her chin held high. She appeared to be in her early 50s with an expensive-looking bob haircut highlighted to perfection, and not a strand out of place. Her pressed white blouse and tailored navy pants gave her the air of someone who had never gotten her hands dirty a day in her life. The clipboard she clutched to her chest might as well have been a scepter. "Good evening, everyone," she announced, her voice carrying across the room without effort. "Let us begin." No introduction was necessary. Everyone knew exactly who she was. I sat awkwardly in the back row, feeling like the new kid in school as Corinne Beaumont called the meeting to order. For the next 40 minutes, I watched in growing discomfort as she methodically listed infractions, approved or denied requests, and issued deadlines for compliance on everything from mailbox styles to garden gnome placement. The Henderson property on Lakeview Drive has an unapproved bird bath that exceeds the decorative item height restriction by 3 inches, she declared, staring directly at a middle-aged couple who seemed to shrink in their seats. "You have 7 days to replace it with a compliant model." When she finished addressing the agenda items, she smiled for the first time. "Do we have any new residents joining us tonight?" Several heads turned in my direction. I raised my hand reluctantly. "Yes, I just moved into the old Miller property on Shore Road." Corinne's eyes narrowed slightly as she studied me. "Ah yes, lakefront, welcome." Her tone suggested I should feel privileged. "Do you have any questions for the board?" I cleared my throat. "Actually, yes. I have a small fishing boat I was planning to keep at my dock. Is there anything I need to know about that?" The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Corinne's smile tightened, barely containing something that looked like irritation. "New residents should thoroughly read the complete bylaws before making assumptions about lake privileges," she announced to the room. "Section 17 covers watercraft regulations in great detail." My face grew hot as every eye in the room fixed on me. "I did glance through, but must have missed that section," I admitted. "Glancing through is insufficient," Corinne replied sharply. "Lake access is a privilege, not a right, even for waterfront properties. There is an approval process for all watercraft, size restrictions, usage hours, monthly inspection requirements, and of course, the necessary permits and fees." "Fees," I repeated. "But I own the property with lake access. It says so in my deed." A man sitting near Corinne, I would later learn he was Roger, the HOA vice president, let out a short laugh. "Your deed gives you shoreline access, not navigational rights. Those are regulated by the community association." Corinne nodded in agreement. "The permit application fee is $500, with annual renewal of $300. Inspections are $75 each, required monthly during boating season. Hours of operation are restricted to weekdays between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m., with exceptions for association-approved events." My mouth fell open. That seems excessive for a small fishing boat that would just sit at my own dock most of the time. Corinne's expression hardened. "The rules exist to preserve the aesthetic and environmental integrity of our lake. If you have concerns about following them, perhaps lakefront living is not for you." She checked her watch theatrically. "Now, if there are no other questions, this meeting is adjourned." As people filed out, I noticed Martha watching me with sympathy. Outside in the parking lot, she approached quietly. "Do not take it personally," she said. "Corinne does this to everyone new. She loves her power." "Is it always this strict?" I asked. Martha nodded. "Ever since she became president. By the way, if you do apply for boat permits, do not mention fishing. The Lakeside Fishing Club is her pet project and they do not like competition." That night, I pored over Section 17 of the bylaws. The rules were even more restrictive than Karen had indicated. Between the lines about approved watercraft materials and visual impact assessments was a subsection devoted to the Lakeside Fishing Club, apparently the only group with unrestricted access to what were repeatedly called community waters. Photographs in the community newsletter showed Karen and about 12 other residents, including Roger, proudly displaying their catches aboard matching pontoon boats with custom LFC flags. The article described them as stewards of the lake and detailed their exclusive monthly tournaments and conservation efforts. Something about this arrangement felt deeply wrong. How could one small group claim special privileges on water that touched multiple properties? But as a newcomer already singled out at my first meeting, I decided to play by the rules. For now. I placed the rulebook on my coffee table and walked out onto my deck, looking at the empty space where my boat should have been. The peaceful lake now seemed less like a dream and more like contested territory, with Karen Beaumont clearly marking her domain. 3 weeks passed with my boat still in storage. The application forms for water privileges sat half-completed on my kitchen counter, the excessive fees and invasive questionnaire about my intended water usage patterns, making me hesitate each time I tried to finish them. Spring was turning to summer, and the perfect fishing season was slipping away while my small boat gathered dust. One perfect Saturday morning I woke before dawn. The lake was still as glass, reflecting the pink-gold light of sunrise like a mirror. No boats disturbed the surface. Not even the almighty fishing club was out this early. A feeling of quiet rebellion stirred within me as I made a decision. This was my property, my dock, and according to my deed, my lake access. I would put my boat in the water just for today and deal with the consequences later. By 7 a.m., I had retrieved my modest 16-foot aluminum fishing boat from storage and carefully backed it down my private boat ramp. The familiar sound of the small outboard motor purring to life brought genuine joy as I secured the boat to my dock and began setting up my fishing gear. The piece lasted exactly 42 minutes. I was just casting my line when I heard the unmistakable sound of angry footsteps marching down my wooden dock. The planks practically vibrated with self-righteous fury. This is a direct violation of Section 17.3. The voice sliced through the morning calm like a knife. I turned to see Karen standing at the edge of my dock, arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her face was contorted with indignation, cheeks flushed with anger. Behind her stood Roger and another board member I recognized from the meeting but whose name I had forgotten. Both men wore expressions of grim satisfaction, like hall monitors who had caught someone running. "Good morning," I replied as calmly as possible. "Is there a problem?" Karen's eyes widened at my feigned ignorance. "A problem? You have an unauthorized watercraft in community waters. No permit, no inspection, and outside of approved hours." Each offense was emphasized with increasing volume. I stepped onto the dock, facing her directly. "This is my property, and according to my deed, I have full rights to lake access." Roger stepped forward. "Your deed gives you shoreline access only. The lake itself is community property under HOA jurisdiction." He spoke with the confidence of someone who had recited this line many times before. I was not aware I needed permission to use my own boat on my own property, I said, feeling my initial politeness giving way to frustration. The fees and restrictions seem excessive for what should be a basic property right. Karen's voice rose, carrying clearly across the still morning air. "This is precisely why we have rules, to prevent selfish individuals from disturbing the community standards we have worked so hard to establish." She was practically performing now, ensuring her voice would reach neighboring properties. That unregistered boat is an eyesore and potential environmental hazard. My temperature rose. My boat was well maintained, freshly painted, and certainly less intrusive than the oversized pontoon boats the fishing club paraded around. "There is nothing wrong with my boat," I said firmly, "and I am not disturbing anyone." "You have 48 hours to remove this eyesore or face daily fines," Corinne declared, pulling an official-looking form from her clipboard and slapping it against my chest. "Starting at $500 and doubling each day thereafter." With that, she spun on her heel and marched back down the dock, her two enforcers following in perfect formation. I looked down at the violation notice, printed on bright orange paper with "immediate action required" stamped across the top. As they disappeared around the side of my house, movement caught my eye from the neighboring property. An elderly man with silver hair stood at our property line, watching the scene with a knowing expression. This must be George, the neighbor on my other side whom I had seen but not yet properly met. "Mind if I come over?" he called softly. George walked slowly along the shoreline, his weathered face telling the story of many years spent outdoors. He glanced toward where Corinne had departed before speaking. "I figured it would not be long before you got your first notice," he said, his voice low as if afraid of being overheard. "She does not like anyone new having boats unless they join her precious fishing club." "Is it always this extreme?" I asked, still clutching the crumpled notice. George nodded solemnly. "She bankrupted the Thompsons last year over a garden shed that was 4 inches taller than regulation. They fought it, but the legal fees—" he shook his head. "Nobody stands up to her anymore, not worth the trouble." "She cannot actually own the lake, can she?" I asked. George shrugged. "Been living here 30 years, and I still do not know exactly how these water rights work. But Corinne has the board, the bylaws, and an attorney on speed dial. Most folks just give in." That night, I sat at my kitchen table staring at the $500 fine notice under the harsh light of my overhead lamp. The orange paper seemed to mock me. Outside my window, the lake I had saved 15 years to live beside shimmered in the moonlight, beautiful but apparently forbidden. Something hardened inside me as I picked up the notice and read it again. This was not just about a boat anymore. The way Corinne had spoken to me, the way George described her history of bullying neighbors into submission, it was a pattern of intimidation that had clearly been going on for years. I opened my laptop and began searching for information about lake property rights in our state. If Corinne wanted to play hardball over water access, I needed to understand exactly what my deed really meant. By the time I went to bed, I had scheduled an appointment with a real estate attorney and requested copies of my complete property records from the county assessor's office. This was a fight I had not asked for, but one I suddenly felt compelled to finish, not just for myself, but for everyone who had been bullied by Corinne's reign over Lake Evergreen. The county record's office was housed in a brutalist concrete building that smelled of old paper and industrial carpet cleaner. After explaining my situation to the clerk, an older woman named Patricia, with glasses hanging from a beaded chain around her neck, she led me to a corner with a microfiche reader and several large map drawers. "Property boundaries around lakes can be tricky," Patricia explained, pulling out large yellow documents from a drawer labeled Lake Evergreen 1951-975. "Water rights are especially complicated because they can be divided or transferred separately from land rights." For the next several hours, I hunched over maps and property records, my finger tracing boundary lines that contradicted everything the HOA had claimed. Patricia seemed increasingly interested in my search, occasionally pointing out details I had missed. "This is odd," she said, adjusting her glasses as she examined a survey from 1962. "According to these original township maps, your parcel includes not just the shoreline, but extends to encompass approximately 60% of the actual lake bed." She traced the boundary with a pencil eraser. "See how this line runs through the middle of the water?" My heart rate increased. "Are you sure? The HOA claims the lake itself is community property." Patricia shook her head. "That is not what these records show. The original developer of the area, Evergreen Properties, sold most lots with partial lake bed rights, but your property, Lot 47, appears to have been given the majority share. These rights were never transferred to any homeowners association according to our records." I left the records office with copies of every relevant document, my mind racing with possibilities. The next stop was the office of Benjamin Hayes, a real estate attorney specializing in waterfront property disputes. Benjamin was in his 60s with salt and pepper hair and reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. He examined the documents carefully, occasionally making notes or consulting reference books from his shelves. "This is fascinating," he said finally, looking up at me. "Based on these records, you do indeed own most of the lake bed, approximately 63% according to the survey coordinates. The remaining portions are divided among other lakefront properties, but none of them individually owns more than 8%. "What about the HOA?" I asked. "They act like they have complete control over the lake." Benjamin leaned back in his chair. "That is the interesting part. I cannot find any legal document transferring ownership or control of these water rights to the homeowners association. They may have been operating under the assumption of authority for years, but without a recorded transfer of rights, their rules regarding the lake would be essentially unenforceable against the actual owner." "Which would be me," I said quietly, the implications slowly sinking in. "Exactly. And moreover," Benjamin continued, "any fees they have collected for lake usage, any restrictions they have imposed on water activities, all would be without legal standing. Their fishing club has effectively been trespassing on your property for years." The following days became a blur of additional legal consultations and document research. I spread papers across my kitchen table as Benjamin highlighted critical passages in the property deed and original land survey. "The HOA has been operating under false pretenses," he confirmed during our third meeting, tapping a section that clearly delineated my water rights. "They have no authority to restrict your use of the lake, and furthermore, their exclusive fishing club has been trespassing on your property for years." As this realization sank in, I felt a strange calm replace my initial anger. Karen had built her power on intimidation and misinformation. Now I possessed something far more valuable, irrefutable legal facts. That evening, I stood on my dock watching the sunset with new eyes. The same water that had seemed so forbidden now legally belonged mostly to me. Across the lake, I could see 3 pontoon boats with the LFC flags, Karen's fishing club, out for their evening patrol. They moved with the confidence of people who believed they owned the waters beneath them. I thought of George and the Thompsons and all the other neighbors who had been bullied into submission. I thought of the exorbitant fees collected over years from residents who just wanted to enjoy the natural beauty they lived beside. Mostly, I thought about Karen's smug face as she slapped that violation notice against my chest. The lake's surface turned golden, then deep orange as the sun dipped lower. I had come here seeking peace and natural beauty, not conflict. But sometimes justice requires standing up to bullies, especially when they have been targeting an entire community. With the property records now in my possession, I had the means to end Corinne's aquatic tyranny permanently. What I needed next was a strategic plan. "Your case is ironclad," Benjamin Hayes said, closing the thick folder of evidence we had compiled over the past 3 weeks. The senior partners of his law firm nodded in agreement as we sat in their wood-paneled conference room. "Not only do you have clear ownership rights to the majority of the lake, but we have documented 17 separate occasions in the past month alone where the HOA fishing club has trespassed on your property without permission." I had been methodical, photographing each boat, recording timestamps, and even using GPS coordinates to prove they were operating in my waters. My kitchen had transformed into a war room of sorts, with maps, legal documents, and strategy notes covering every surface. "What are my options?" I asked, looking at the 3 attorneys seated across from me. Benjamin adjusted his glasses. "You have several. You could simply notify the HOA of your ownership and demand they cease all regulation of lake activities. You could seek financial damages for years of unauthorized use. Or," he paused, "you could take a more strategic approach that might address the underlying problem." "Corinne," I said flatly. "Precisely," he replied. "From what you have described and the witness statements we have collected, this is not merely about lake rights. It is about one person abusing authority to control and intimidate an entire community." The younger attorney, Jessica, spoke up. "We have compiled statements from 7 current residents describing various instances of overreach and intimidation. Most were too afraid to sign formal affidavits, but their verbal accounts establish a clear pattern of behavior." I thought for a moment. I do not want to just assert my rights and become the new lake tyrant. I want to fix the broken system. Benjamin smiled. "That might be possible with the right approach. Here is what we propose." The plan they outlined was comprehensive, multi-phased, and designed to maximize impact while minimizing legal vulnerability. I would not just confront Corinne. I would dismantle the entire power structure she had built, using her own methods against her. Over the next 2 weeks, I carefully approached selected neighbors who seemed most victimized by Corinne's regime. George was my first ally, and through him, I met others who had stories to tell. "She fined me $800 for having wind chimes," whispered Eleanor, a retired schoolteacher. "Said they created unauthorized auditory disturbances." "My grandchildren are not allowed to use pool floats on the lake," George added. "Only fishing club members can bring flotation devices into the water." Bit by bit, I gathered information and allies, being extremely careful not to tip off Corinne or her board members. Several neighbors agreed to provide written statements about their experiences, though most would only do so anonymously, fearing retaliation. Meanwhile, my legal team drafted a series of documents: cease and desist letters, property rights notifications, and a comprehensive proposal for restructuring lake access under a fair and transparent system. The timing would be crucial. After consulting the community newsletter, I discovered that the annual fishing tournament, Lake Evergreen's most prestigious event, was scheduled for the following Saturday. Corinne always hosted this event, using it to showcase her authority and reinforcing the fishing club's elite status in the community. "That is when we move," I told Benjamin during our final planning meeting, at the height of their annual power display. The night before the tournament, I barely slept. My dining room table was covered with copies of all the legal documents, organized into folders for various contingencies. Outside on the lake, I could see lights as fishing club members prepared their boats for the big day. From my window, I watched Corinne directing people around her dock, her gestures sharp and commanding even at a distance. For a brief moment, doubt crept in. Was I taking this too far? Was it worth the conflict and potential animosity from those loyal to Corinne? Then I remembered the resignation in George's eyes when he talked about the Thompsons losing their home. I thought about the children not allowed to swim freely in water that touched their parents' property. I recalled the arrogance in Corinne's voice when she slapped that violation notice against my chest. No, this wasn't pettiness or revenge for its own sake. This was about restoring fairness to a community that had been bullied into silent submission for too long. My hands trembled slightly as I reviewed the documents one final time. There would be no turning back once the plan was set in motion. But for the first time since moving to Lake Evergreen, I felt something beyond anger or frustration. I felt powerful. Not the false power that comes from intimidating others, but the genuine strength that comes from standing up for what is right. As dawn broke over the lake, boats began gathering for the tournament. I watched through my window as Corinne's pontoon, larger and more elaborate than any other, took the central position, a large lakeside fishing club banner flapping in the morning breeze. The stage was set. In 3 hours, Benjamin and his team would arrive, accompanied by a county sheriff deputy and a court representative. Everything was ready. I stepped onto my dock and took a deep breath of the morning air. Today, Lake Evergreen would learn who really owned these waters. The tournament began at precisely 9 o'clock. From my dock, I watched through binoculars as 15 boats spread across the lake, each carrying members of Corinne's exclusive fishing club. Her pontoon boat was decorated with streamers and a large scoreboard, positioned at what she had designated the tournament center. Ironically, almost exactly over the deepest part of the lake, which my property deed clearly showed belonged to me. At exactly 10:30, right on schedule, a sleek motorboat approached from the public launch site on the far shore. Benjamin stood at the bow, his gray hair ruffled by the wind, accompanied by a uniformed sheriff's deputy and a woman in a business suit carrying a briefcase, the court representative. I raised my hand in a subtle signal. The plan was in motion. Through my binoculars, I watched as their boat approached Corinne's pontoon. Benjamin handed her a thick envelope, legal papers that included a cease and desist order, trespassing notification, and court summons. Even from shore, I could see her expression transform from confusion to disbelief to rage. At first, she seemed dismissive, attempting to hand the papers back. The sheriff's deputy said something, pointing to the documents. Corinne began reading, her body language shifting visibly with each page. Her head snapped up, looking toward my property before returning to the documents. Her voice carried across the water, first controlled, then increasingly shrill as the reality of the situation became clear. She was gesturing wildly now, pointing toward shore, toward me, toward the papers. Other boats were drawing closer to see what was happening. I could not hear exactly what was being said, but I did not need to. The legal documents were clear. All fishing club activities were to cease immediately as they constituted trespassing on private property. All HOA regulations regarding lake usage were declared null and void, and Corinne personally was being summoned to court to answer for years of collecting unauthorized fees under false pretenses. Within 20 minutes, boats began returning to shore, their occupants visibly confused and concerned. Word spread rapidly across the lake. My phone began ringing with calls from neighbors who had heard fragments of information. By evening, an emergency HOA meeting had been called, the community center packed beyond capacity. I arrived 15 minutes early with Benjamin and his team, taking seats in the front row. The room buzzed with anxious conversation, speculation, and confusion. Corinne arrived last, her usual composed appearance noticeably disrupted. Her hair was slightly disheveled, her expression tight with barely controlled fury. She marched to the podium, refusing to make eye contact with me. This emergency meeting will address baseless claims regarding lake ownership and HOA authority, she began, her voice brittle. Our legal team assures me. Benjamin stood. If I may interrupt, Mrs. Beaumont, these claims are far from baseless, and I believe the community deserves to know the truth. Before Corinne could object, I joined Benjamin at the front of the room. We had prepared a presentation, which the court representative, who had authority to validate property documents, helped us display on the wall screen. For years, you have been misled about who owns this lake, I explained, my voice steady despite my pounding heart. My property deed, verified by county records and multiple legal experts, clearly shows that I own approximately 63% of Lake Evergreen's bed. The historical maps appeared on screen, boundary lines clearly marked. The court representative stepped forward to confirm the authenticity of the documents. The HOA has never had the authority to regulate lake usage, charge fees for water access, or restrict activities on the majority of the lake, Benjamin explained. Furthermore, the Lakeside Fishing Club has been regularly trespassing on private property. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. Corinne attempted to interrupt repeatedly, her face flushed with anger, but each time Benjamin silenced her with another piece of irrefutable evidence. This is preposterous, Corinne finally exploded. This lake has been community property since the development was established. The court representative stepped forward, adjusting her glasses. I have personally verified the county records dating back to 1962. At no point was ownership of the lake bed transferred to the Homeowners Association. The documents clearly show that Lot 47, now owned by this gentleman, includes ownership rights to the majority of the lake. For 2 hours, we methodically presented evidence, answered questions, and outlined the legal reality that had been hidden from residents for years. Emotions in the room ranged from shock to outrage, not directed at me, but at the system that had misled them for so long. So all the fees we paid for lake access were collected fraudulently? Asked a man in the third row. Legally speaking, yes, Benjamin confirmed. Any fees collected for access to property that the HOA did not own would constitute misrepresentation at minimum. In our boats, our docks, all the restrictions, asked another resident. All unenforceable, I explained. Each waterfront property owner has rights to the portion of lake bed that extends from their property. No one needed permission from the HOA to use their own water access. As the reality sank in, I could see the community I had hoped to join peacefully now looked at me with a mixture of shock, respect, and the dawning realization that everything was about to change. Corinne sat rigid in her chair, her carefully constructed kingdom crumbling before her eyes. "So what happens now?" George asked from the back of the room. "Do you own the lake? Do we all lose access?" I stepped forward, ready to share the second part of our presentation, not just exposing the problem, but proposing a solution that would benefit everyone. This had never been about becoming the new lake tyrant. It was about creating something better from the ruins of Corinne's regime. Autumn leaves in brilliant shades of red and gold reflected on the lake's surface as children's laughter echoed across the water. From my deck, I watched families enjoying kayaks, small fishing boats, and paddle boards, all without fear of arbitrary fines or restrictions. 6 months had passed since the emergency meeting that had changed everything at Lake Evergreen. The transition had not been simple. Karen had attempted legal countermeasures, filing lawsuits challenging the property records and claiming adverse possession. Each attempt collapsed under scrutiny, ultimately leading to the dissolution of the original HOA board when financial audits revealed years of questionable accounting practices regarding the collected lake fees. What emerged from the chaos was something none of us expected: a genuine community. The new Lake Evergreen Association operated on principles of transparency and actual property rights. Instead of dictating rules, we had developed guidelines collaboratively through a series of town hall meetings where every resident had a voice. "Best decision we ever made," George said, joining me on the dock with 2 cups of coffee. Now the vice president of the new association, he had become both neighbor and friend. Having the annual picnic out here where everyone can actually enjoy the lake, Karen would have never allowed this. I nodded, watching elderly residents teaching grandchildren to fish from docks that had stood empty for years. "How are the new access agreements working out?" "Perfect," George replied. "Everyone understands their actual property rights now, but they also appreciate the shared guidelines. Turns out people are pretty reasonable when they are not being threatened and extorted." The solution we had implemented was straightforward. I legally recognized each lakefront property owner's right to access the water adjoining their land, while we collectively established sensible safety and environmental protection guidelines that everyone could support. The fishing club was reformed as an inclusive organization open to all residents, with tournaments that benefited local charities rather than enforcing status hierarchies. Many neighbors had approached me privately in the months following the confrontation, sharing stories of years of intimidation that had prevented them from enjoying their own properties. Martha had not hosted family gatherings for a decade after Karen cited her for excessive visitor vehicles. The Johnsons had never launched their canoe after being threatened with fines they could not afford. "Did you see the community newsletter?" George asked, sipping his coffee. I smiled. "First time in years it does not include a violation section. And property values are up 15% since spring," he added. "Turns out people want to live in a community where they are not terrorized by their neighbors. Who knew?" As we talked, I noticed a moving truck parked in front of Karen's colonial-style house across the lake. She had listed the property for sale the previous month after her final attempt to rally supporters had failed spectacularly. Few residents were willing to back her once the financial audit revealed how their lake access fees had been spent, primarily on fishing club equipment and landscaping for board members' properties. Later that afternoon, I walked around the lake, speaking with neighbors and checking on the new shared dock we had built at the public access point. As I passed Karen's house, I saw her supervising movers loading the last of her furniture. Our eyes met briefly across the yard. For a moment, I expected anger or accusations, but instead, I saw something unexpected: resignation, perhaps even a glimmer of understanding. She gave a stiff nod before turning away. I felt no triumph in that moment, only relief that peace had finally returned to the lakeside community I now proudly called home. The following weekend, we held the first truly community-wide fishing derby. Children and adults of all skill levels participated, with prizes awarded for categories that ensured everyone had a chance to win something. George's grandchildren proudly displayed their most colorful catch ribbons while showing off the small sunfish they had caught from his previously unused dock. As sunset painted the lake in breathtaking hues of purple and gold, I stood on my dock reflecting on the journey of the past year. What had begun as a simple dream of lakeside living had evolved into something far more meaningful.